few months ago, a pretty young female friend of mine was in town from LA. This was her first trip to the East Coast, so she was excited to jump into Boston, see what the city's old world charm was all about. But she had a problem. She didn't have anybody to hang out with. And I was leaving for a trip to Pittsburgh, correctly pronounced Schittsburg, the next day, so she was pretty much on her own. It's just not that fun for me to explore a new city alone, she said. I need somebody that knows cool places, takes me there, and tells me fun stories about them. I need Goodwill Hunting. Where can I find Goodwill Hunting to show me around Boston and give me the real Boston? Well, I said, that's a tough one, because Boston's sort of a different Boston now, and Goodwill Hunting probably had to move to Saugus in like '09 after they converted his dumpy one-bedroom into an $800,000 condo. I mean, the man's a math genius, and he can't afford to live in South Boston.
My boy's wicked smart.
Is that fair, really?
You're suspect.
We really think that's fair? Well, it depends on how you look at it. Goodwill Hunting did drink beers every day and throw cigarette butts all over his front yard. So who the fuck wants to live next to that? He was also a violent offender.
I don't love you.
And as someone who has been beaten up in 7th grade by a bully, I have zero interest living near violent people.
Don't tell me about my world. Don't tell me about my world.
Okay, try this, I said. Go on Tinder and try and find a Goodwill Hunting guy. You're just gonna have to expand the search radius outside of Boston proper, because no Goodwill Huntings really live downtown. She ended up going on a date with Ben, a handsome, not tall, guy who lived in the South End and grew up in Belmont. He made promises of being a real Boston man, but he didn't even have an accent, she said.
I mean, you just want to have your little fling with, like, the guy from the other side of town.
He did have a really nice roof deck, though, and that was enough to get him a solid makeout session. But alas, Goodwill Hunting, he was not. So you're gonna go on a second date, I said? He wants to, she said, but I feel like he'll be expecting second date sex, so I'm just gonna pass. Wait, would you have fucked him if he had the accent? If he had the accent and the roof deck, he wouldn't need a second date. So, lonely chicks from LA aside, I grew up in Somerville, and I love living here today. Only a handful of friends or family kind of made it through and are still here. Most of them had to move out to the suburbs. They did it for better schools or bigger homes, but most of them didn't really have a choice. They just couldn't afford to stay. I mean, every coin has two sides. I feel like the plus and minus of that reality, but what I've realized is that the identity of Boston as a blue-collar, hard-nosed city just isn't reality anymore. We've changed, and maybe we changed for the better, but it does leave me nostalgic for the stories my uncles used to tell when they'd get drunk at a cookout or a family gathering. One time my uncle told me that him and his friends found a bunch of plywood in the projects. They took it to North Station, and they made a makeshift bridge from North Station up onto the roof of the old Boston Garden. So they could get up onto the roof and sneak down into the air vents, and they would go to concerts, Celtics games, Bruins games. One time they saw Led Zeppelin. My dad said that people were jumping so hard, he literally thought the rafters were gonna collapse. But he didn't give a fuck. He was drunk, he was probably high. He said it was the greatest night of his life. So eventually, they started putting guard dogs up on the roof, and if you got caught,
Stop right there!
Oh shit!
they would take your shoes and take your belt, tie the belt around your shoes and throw it off the roof of the garden, and then they would make you walk down the steel fire escapes, which were all spiky and pointy, so it would fuck your feet up, but, you know, that hopefully taught you not to do it. My cousin Johnny ran an escort business in Copley Square in the 80s.
Like, how much would you make a week?
God, I've had a weekend where we made 10 grand in a weekend.
He had a client that used to ask the girls to be very quiet and meet him at the back door. He would tell them that his wife was upstairs asleep. Years later, Johnny was interviewing new girls, and when the client's name came up, she said, "Oh, I know him. He used to pay me to pretend to be his wife for years. He used to make me sleep upstairs in his bed when all the other girls came in." So this guy wasn't even married. He was basically just paying two hookers, one to pretend to be his wife, and the other one... So I don't know if that was like a fetish for him, or maybe if he thought that the hookers might respect him more because he was married. Like, I don't know. That's a weird one. Anyways, that's the kind of shit that I love to hear about. Like weird, eccentric, crazy things that maybe still happen, but back in the day, it was just a little bit rougher, a little bit less sterilized. You know, the Combat Zone, Boston's old red light district, Kenmore Square's old punk scene. The city is teeming with great stories. I love to hear them, and I love people's reactions to them. When I tell people these stories, their eyes light up. They get interested. That's what what Old Dirty Boston is really all about. It's preserving a sometimes ignored, pretty recent history of everyday Bostonians and some of their greatest adventures in these Boston streets. It's not about celebrity. It's not about, what's in the news today. It's like what was happening in 1975 in your local dive bar. What was happening on Winter Hill in 1980? Who were the guys that were robbing banks and knocking over armored cars? These stories are genuinely interesting to me because they're a fabric of my life and my identity. I'm third generation Somerville. So learning more about the city, learning more about the people, eventually I'm learning more about me and why my parents had that identity. All my dad and his friends, all these guys from that era, the biggest compliment they give is he was a tough guy. He was tough. He could fight. And I'm always like, yeah, great. But now I sort of understand there was a lawlessness and like being tough was a real thing. It was a real badge of honor or courage. A lot of your identity had to do with how tough you were in the street life of Boston.